Over the last few months of creating videos for this channel, I've used it as a platform to attempt to analyse why I like or don't like certain films and shows, and in doing so, I've been able to air some of my more controversial opinions. Over the course of this video, I'm going to present possibly my most controversial opinion yet, and try to understand why I feel the way I do about Zack Snyder's 2013 Superman movie. Because Man of Steel is my favourite superhero movie, and by extension one of my favourite films of all time. I want to underpin this entire video by saying that this is purely my opinion, and I understand a lot of the criticisms and grievances people have with the movie. That said, I'm going to attempt to explain why I love this movie so much, and hopefully I might convince some of you to give it another shot through a different lens. There are a lot of technical and cosmetic elements that I really enjoy with this film. Hans Zimmer's score is an absolute treat, and I love his new theme for Superman. It may not be as iconic as the original Williams soundtrack, but I don't think it has to be. The new theme was memorable in its own right, and felt perfectly suited to this take on the character. I really liked the way the film was shot. The film utilised what felt like a somewhat reined in and more naturalistic version of Snyder's usually hyper-stylised sensibilities. The use of handheld camera work may not be for everyone, but I thought it was done tastefully here. I'm a sucker for Snyder's crash zooms and the use of anamorphic lenses as well. And the CGI and integration of VFX elements was, barring one or two exceptions, really well done. I didn't really find myself doubting any of the events of the movie, even during the big bombastic action sequences, which I think is partly because the film isn't quite as stylised as Snyder's other films, including his other DC efforts. Another thing I really liked about this film was its sense of scale. Almost paradoxically, everything felt huge yet small at the same time. You got a real sense of the wider consequences through the cutaways to background extras and the emphasis on some of the supporting cast, but also because the main cast was relatively small, the conflicts felt really personal. I think the film does a fantastic job at portraying the Kryptonian characters, namely Superman and General Zod, as these godlike beings who are ultimately just people. I found that fascinating, and I can't think of another film that's done this in such a way. However, most of these things are technical, and although the technical elements are important in making a film viewing experience enjoyable, they're not the only thing the filmmakers have to be concerned about. It goes without saying that the story and characters are the driving force of almost any fiction film, and if they don't work, you will struggle to find engagement with the events depicted on screen. And for a lot of people, the story and characters in this film did not work, and that's completely fine, but they did work for me, and here's why. Clark's journey of self-discovery as he tries to figure out his place in the world was incredibly resonant to me. Sure, nobody can empathise with the specific plight of being essentially a god with superpowers and invulnerability, but the idea of being an outcast and working out your place in the world is something that I think everyone can understand on some level. In spite of his alien heritage and incredible powers, Clark is basically just a regular person, and goes through a lot of regular struggles like dealing with bullying as a child. I found his characterisation in this film really interesting because of how ordinary his life is in that regard. How would a normal person react and respond to having these gifts? And I think Man of Steel attempts to answer that question well, while at the same time remaining loosely faithful to the character in the source material. But ultimately this is not the Superman that we know from the comics yet. It is an origin story through and through, and over the course of the film, as he accepts his responsibility as a beacon of hope for mankind, you see him slowly begin to become the character we know. But ultimately Snyder's depiction of Superman in this film was one that I really connected with. He felt real and, bizarrely given his supernatural powers, far more relatable than some other DC superheroes like Batman. Don't get me wrong, Batman is one of my favourite characters of all time, but I related way more to Clark's journey of self-discovery in this film than Bruce's tormented yet privileged life. I understand criticisms of the Superman character, and I get why people might perceive his characterisation in the film as overly stoic and somewhat bland, but I think Henry Cavill did a great job at portraying a regular, if idealised, 21st century man. This version of the character is one that for the first half of the film wants to stay hidden, and so to me it makes perfect sense that he would be a more subtle character. And when he needs to be, he transforms into the ideal leader for humanity, and you see that shift in his performance from a somewhat awkward young man finding his place in the world to a more recognisable Superman over the course of the film. I do find it somewhat strange that Superman as a pop culture icon has been placed by some on this pedestal as an immovable staple with no room for alternative interpretation. It's almost hypocritical to see some critics fine with the Adam West and Christian Bale versions of the Batman character existing in the same media space, yet the Christopher Reeve version of Superman is the only interpretation they are willing to accept. It's what makes the DC properties so interesting and, frankly, sustainable. These characters have existed for almost a century now, and that's only because of their flexibility and ability to be reimagined by differing writers and creatives to suit the sensibilities of the time. Snyder's interpretation of Superman in this film, as discussed, to me felt perfectly suited to the 21st century context in which it was produced, but at the same time ended with the promise of continued growth for the character in which he would develop into a more traditional version that we are familiar with. A promise which ultimately was never truly delivered on, but that's a topic for another time. Returning to Man of Steel and its characters, I'd like to briefly discuss General Zod. Not that it's a particularly high bar, but to me he remains the best villain in the DCEU. His motivations are clear, and despite his villainous and nigh-on maniacal approach, you can understand his viewpoint. As one of the final surviving Kryptonians, responsible for safeguarding his people, of course he wants to create a new sanctuary and restore his race. Michael Shannon delivers a great performance as usual, and works as a great foil for Superman in this origin story. The other members of the cast are similarly strong, and each are given plenty to do throughout the film. Amy Adams' Lois Lane is perhaps a little underutilised in the second half, but I thought her story in the first half, as she attempts to uncover Clark's identity, worked well, and I found it refreshing to have a version of the character competent enough to do so. But as discussed, there weren't actually that many key characters relative to the scope of the drama, and so despite the massive stakes of the story, the tension between everyone felt much more intimate. This juxtaposition worked well for me, and I really liked it tonally. Man of Steel is by no means a perfect film, but through the strong depictions of the characters, great technical prowess, and a sense of scale that matched the events on screen, I really enjoy it. As DC's cinematic follow-up to the Dark Knight trilogy, I thought it worked incredibly well, and given how the DC Extended Universe project continued after this film, I do lament what could have been. Indeed, where Man of Steel was a triumph for me personally, its follow-up Batman v Superman failed, but that's a topic for another video. What did you think about Man of Steel? I'd be really curious to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Did you like it or not, and why? I'm planning on doing a couple more videos about the DC films given the recent release of Zack Snyder's Justice League, so let me know if there's anything you'd like me to discuss. If you've enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like and subscribing for more. And until next time, thanks.